The wind was a blade against her cheek, scouring away tears before they had the chance to freeze. It was the only thing that moved in the vast, bleached emptiness of the plains. That, and the dust-colored wagon shrinking against the horizon, taking with it the last of the world she had known. He had not looked back. Not once. The sound of his final words echoed louder than the ceaseless wind, a venom that seeped into the marrow of her bones. A daughter who cannot stand is no daughter of mine. The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away. Let the wolves have what's left. The cruelty was so pure, so absolute, it had a weight of its own, pressing her down into the dirt where he had thrown her. Pain was a white-hot sun blooming behind her eyes, radiating from the twin fires in her lower legs. She tried to move, to drag herself toward some unseen, impossible shelter, but the slightest shift sent a grinding, sickening message of brokenness through her entire body. The bones, shattered by the wagon tongue he had used as a club, grated against each other. A choked gasp tore from her throat, raw and animal. This, then, was to be her grave. An unmarked patch of cracked earth beneath a sky the color of faded linen. Her father, a man who spoke of God's mercy with every Sunday breath, had delivered his final sermon with iron and wood, leaving her as an offering to the wilderness. Despair was a cold, heavy blanket. She closed her eyes, the grit of the plains scraping against her lids. She could feel the sun beating down, a merciless hammer. Thirst was already a living thing in her throat, clawing and rasping. She thought of her mother, 2 years gone, a woman whose gentleness had been the only buffer against his righteousness. Would her mother have allowed this? The question was a useless cruelty she inflicted upon herself. The world had shrunk to this single, agonizing point of existence, the pain in her legs, the dust in her lungs, the unforgiving sky above. There was no past, no future, only the brutal, unending present. She smelled the dry, spicy scent of sagebrush and the faint, metallic tang of her own blood. Every gust of wind felt like a predator's breath, testing her for weakness. And she was nothing but weakness now, a broken doll discarded by a wrathful child. Loneliness was not simply an absence of people, it was a presence, a vast and crushing entity that settled over the land and found its home inside her chest. The silence between the shrieks of the wind was absolute, a deafness that screamed of oblivion. As the sun began its slow, merciless descent, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, a new kind of fear trickled into the edges of her pain-fogged consciousness. The cold. The night. The things that hunted in the dark. She had heard the coyotes chorus from the relative safety of the wagon many times, a sound that had once seemed mournful and wild. Now, it sounded like a promise. A shadow fell across her face, long and sharp in the dying light. It was so sudden, so silent, that she thought it was a hallucination, a vulture circling to claim its prize. She forced her eyes open. A horse, dark as polished cherry wood, stood over her, its breath pluming in the cooling air. And astride it, a man. He was a silhouette against the bleeding sky, broad-shouldered and still. He seemed less a man and more a feature of the landscape, carved from the same hard rock and unforgiving earth that surrounded them. Terror, sharp and undiluted, lanced through her. Her father had left her for the wolves, but perhaps a man was the first to arrive. He dismounted in a single, fluid motion, his boots making no sound on the hard-packed ground. He moved with a deliberation that was unnerving, his gaze fixed on her. She could see his face now, shadowed by the brim of a stained hat. It was a stern, quiet face, weathered by sun and wind, with eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He did not speak. He knelt, his knees cracking softly, and his attention went directly to her legs. His touch was surprisingly light as he examined the damage, his fingers probing the mangled flesh and protruding angles of bone with a practiced, impersonal competence. She flinched, a strangled cry escaping her lips. His eyes, the color of slate, met hers for a fleeting second. There was no pity in them, but no malice either. There was only a calm, disquieting assessment. He looked at the empty horizon, then back at her. "He left you," the man said. It was not a question. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. She could only manage a single, desperate nod, the movement sending a fresh wave of agony through her. He stood, a decision made. "Scream if you must," he said, his tone flat. "It will hurt." Before she could process the words, he slid his arms beneath her, one under her shoulders, the other under her knees. The world exploded into pure, white agony. The broken bones shifted, and a sound she did not recognize as her own ripped from her throat, a piercing shriek that the wind stole and carried away into the twilight. He held her fast, his grip unyielding, and lifted her as if she weighed nothing. As he carried her toward his horse, her head lolled against his chest. She could smell sawdust, leather, and clean sweat. It was the scent of work, of life. And as the darkness finally swarmed in to claim her, a single, bewildering thought surfaced through the pain: he had not left her. She awoke to the scent of wood smoke and something bitter, like brewing herbs. For a moment, she was suspended in confusion, her mind refusing to connect the memory of the desolate plain with the reality of this place. A low, steady fire crackled in a stone hearth, casting flickering orange light across a small, sparsely furnished cabin. She was lying on a narrow cot, covered by a heavy wool blanket. The pain in her legs was a dull, throbbing weight, no longer the sharp, searing agony of before. She pushed herself up on her elbows, her breath catching in her throat. Her legs were encased in crude but sturdy splints, fashioned from straight branches and bound tightly with strips of clean cloth. The work was precise, methodical. Someone had set the bones. The man from the plain sat at a small, rough-hewn table, his back to her. He was sharpening a knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only sound besides the fire. He seemed utterly absorbed in his task, a figure of immense and unsettling stillness. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Where was she? Who was he? Every instinct screamed at her to be afraid, to see this as a different kind of trap. A man who lived alone this far from civilization was not a man to be trusted. He was an outcast, a hermit, perhaps a criminal. Yet, she was warm. She was sheltered. Her legs, which her father had intended for the wolves, were bound for healing. The contradiction left her disoriented, caught between terror and a fragile, burgeoning gratitude she dared not acknowledge. He finished with the knife, testing the edge with his thumb before setting it down. He stood and turned, and for the first time, she saw him clearly in the firelight. He was older than she had first thought, perhaps 40 years old, with lines etched around his eyes and mouth that spoke of a hard life, not a cruel one. His dark hair was threaded with grey at the temples. He moved to the hearth, ladling a thin, steaming broth from a black pot into a wooden bowl. He brought it to her, his movements economical and direct. He did not smile or offer words of comfort. He simply held out the bowl. Her hands trembled as she took it. The warmth seeped into her fingers, a small, profound comfort. The broth was thin but savory, and as she sipped it, she felt a measure of strength return to her limbs. He watched her, his slate-grey eyes unreadable. "My name is Silas," he said, breaking the silence. The name was as stark and solid as he was. She swallowed, her throat dry. Elara, the name felt foreign on her tongue, the name of a girl who had a father and a home. Silas gave a curt nod, as if filing the information away. He took the empty bowl from her and returned to his chair at the table. He did not press her for details, did not ask what had happened or why. He seemed to accept her presence as he accepted the weather or the seasons, a fact of his existence now, to be dealt with pragmatically. She lay back against the thin pillow, the smell of the herbal poultice on her legs rising to meet her. It was a clean, earthy smell. He had tended to her wounds. He had set her bones. He had given her broth. These were actions, solid and real, that stood in stark opposition to the fear churning in her belly. She watched him stare into the fire, his profile stern and impassive, and wondered what manner of man would rescue a broken creature from the plains only to treat her with such profound and unnerving detachment. The days bled into one another, measured not by a calendar but by the rhythms of the small cabin and the man who inhabited it. Silas rose before the sun, his movements quiet and purposeful. He would stoke the fire, put coffee on to boil, and then leave, the sound of his footsteps receding as he went to tend his livestock. Elara would be left in the silence, a prisoner of the cot and her own mending body. The pain became her most intimate companion, a constant, throbbing presence that told her she was still alive. Each morning, Silas would leave a bucket of fresh water and a plate of bread or dried meat on the small crate beside her bed. In the evening, he would return, smelling of the outdoors, and prepare a simple meal of beans or stew, which they ate in their customary silence. He never asked about her past, and she never offered it. The story was a stone in her throat, too heavy and sharp to speak. Her father's face, twisted in righteousness, haunted her waking hours. His words were a phantom limb, an ache where a piece of her soul used to be. She learned Silas through his actions, not his words. She saw the way he mended a leather strap with neat, precise stitches, the way he gentled a spooked horse with a low murmur and a steady hand. He was a man of immense capability, his life pared down to the essential tasks of survival. The cabin was a reflection of him, everything had a purpose, and there was no room for adornment or sentimentality. After 2 weeks, the swelling in her legs had gone down enough that the splints grew loose. One evening, Silas approached the cot with fresh strips of cloth and a jar of foul-smelling salve. "This will hurt," he said, his voice as matter-of-fact as always. He unwrapped the bindings, and for the first time, she saw the bruised, discolored flesh, the unnatural angles where the bones were knitting back together. A wave of nausea washed over her. He worked quickly, his rough hand surprisingly gentle as he cleaned the skin and applied the salve. When he began to rebind the splints, tightening them to hold the bones in their proper place, the pain was blinding. She bit down hard on her lip, tasting blood, but did not make a sound. She would not scream again in front of this man. When he was finished, he looked at her, his gaze lingering on her face. He saw the sheen of sweat on her brow, the rigid set of her jaw. For the first time, she thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not pity, but a kind of hard-won respect. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod and returned to his side of the room. The next week, he spent his evenings by the firelight, not sharpening tools, but carving. He worked a piece of seasoned hickory, the shavings falling to the floor in fragrant curls. He was patient and meticulous, measuring the wood against his own leg. A few nights later, he stood and brought his work to her. He placed a pair of sturdy, hand-carved crutches against the wall by her cot. They were plain and functional, but the grips were sanded smooth, shaped to fit a hand. He did not say a word. He did not have to. The crutches were a challenge, a statement. They were the next step, a bridge from the cot to the world. And as she looked at them, then at the silent man watching her from across the room, she understood that he was not her captor, nor was he her savior. He was simply offering her the tools. The choice to stand was hers alone. The decision to stand felt as momentous as deciding to be born again. For days, the crutches leaned against the wall, a silent testament to her fear. Her legs were still a source of alien pain, foreign appendages she did not trust. The memory of their breaking was a physical thing, a ghost that lived in her muscles. To put weight on them seemed a betrayal of their suffering, a risk too great to take. Silas never mentioned them. He went about his chores, leaving her to her internal battle. His silence was not neglect, she was beginning to understand it as a form of respect. He would not push her. He would not command her. He had brought her this far, and the rest of the journey was a path she had to choose to walk herself. One afternoon, while he was out, the silence of the cabin became unbearable. It pressed in on her, amplifying the frantic beating of her own heart. She looked at the 4 walls that had been her entire world for weeks. She looked at the door, beyond which lay a life she could not yet imagine. And she looked at the crutches. Gritting her teeth, she rolled to the edge of the cot and, with a surge of desperate energy, grabbed them. They felt solid and heavy in her hands. Using her arms, she pushed herself upright, her legs dangling uselessly. The room tilted. Sweat beaded on her forehead. She managed to get the crutches under her arms, their tops biting into her flesh. She took a breath, then another. Now! She shifted her weight, preparing to let her feet touch the floor. The moment her soles made contact with the rough wood, a bolt of incandescent pain shot up her legs, so intense it stole her breath. Her knees buckled instantly. The crutches splayed out, and she fell, not with a cry, but with a sharp, defeated gasp. She landed hard on her side, the impact jarring every bone in her body. The fall had not been far, but it felt like a plunge from a great height. Humiliation and agony washed over her in equal measure. She lay on the floor, tangled in her blanket, a pathetic, helpless heap. Just as she was about to surrender to a fresh wave of despair, the cabin door opened. Silas stood there, filling the frame. He took in the scene in a single glance, her on the floor, the overturned crutches, the misery etched on her face. She braced herself for scorn, for pity, for the weary sigh of a man burdened by a useless creature. He offered none of them. He closed the door, walked over to her, and knelt. Without a word, he scooped her up. His strength was absolute, his hold secure. It was not a tender embrace, it was a practical, physical act of retrieval. He did not coddle her or soothe her. He simply lifted her from her failure and placed her back on the cot, her starting point. He set the crutches back against the wall, right where they had been. Then he turned and left the cabin again, leaving her to confront the silent invitation once more. Shaking, her body screaming in protest, Ilara sat up. His reaction, or lack thereof, had stirred something in her. He had not treated her like a fragile invalid. He had treated her like someone who had simply fallen and was expected to get up again. A stubborn fire ignited in her chest, a flicker of the resilience she thought had been burned out of her on the plains. This time, when she reached for the crutches, her hands were steady. The fire of her anger burned brighter than the fire in her legs. She would not be defeated by a wooden floor. She stood again, the pain just as sharp, but this time she was ready for it. She locked her arms, her knuckles white, and held herself upright. 1 second. 2. 3. She was standing. Unsteady, trembling, and drenched in sweat, but she was standing. On her own 2 feet. The cabin, once a world, slowly became a room she could navigate. Each step was a negotiation with pain, each movement a victory. She learned the geography of the small space through the rhythm of her crutches, 3 paces from the cot to the hearth, 5 to the table, 7 to the door. At first, her efforts were clumsy, leaving her exhausted and sore. But with each passing day, a flicker of strength returned to her atrophied muscles. She began to see her contributions not as a debt to be repaid, but as a way to reclaim a piece of herself. One morning, before Silas returned from his chores, she managed to hobble to the hearth and add a log to the dying embers. When he came in, he glanced at the revived fire, then at her, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was more validating than 1,000 words of praise. Soon, she was able to stand at the table, leaning heavily on her crutches, and help prepare their simple meals. She sliced vegetables with a shaking hand, stirred the pot of beans, her arms aching with the effort. It was slow, arduous work, but it was work. It was purpose. It filled the long, silent hours and quieted the relentless turning of her thoughts. The silence between them began to change. It was no longer the tense, watchful silence of 2 strangers thrown together by circumstance. It evolved into a comfortable, shared quiet, the kind that exists between people who understand each other without the need for constant chatter. They would eat their meals at the small table, the only sounds the clink of spoons against bowls and the crackle of the fire. She would watch him, noticing the way his calloused hands were surprisingly deft when mending a piece of tack, the way his eyes would soften almost imperceptibly when he looked out the window at the setting sun. He was a man rooted to this land, as much a part of it as the scrub oak and the hardy grass. One evening, she found a pile of his shirts in a corner, torn and in need of mending. In a small chest at the foot of her cot, she found a needle and a spool of dark thread. Sitting on the edge of her bed, she set to work. Her stitches were small and neat, a skill her mother had insisted upon. It was calming, repetitive work. When Silas came in and saw her sewing, he stopped for a moment in the doorway. She did not look up, her focus entirely on the needle weaving through the coarse fabric. He said nothing, but when she had finished the pile and left the neatly folded shirts on his chair, she found a small, smooth river stone on the crate beside her bed the next morning. It was a simple, useless object, but she knew it was a gesture. It was his way of saying thank you. It was his language. And she was finally beginning to understand it. In these small, unspoken exchanges, they were building something fragile and new. It was not a friendship, not yet. It was a partnership, a quiet alliance against the harshness of the world, forged in the crucible of her healing and his silent, steady presence. She was no longer just the broken woman he had found, she was Ilara, the woman who stoked the fire and mended the shirts, a part of the life within these four walls. The time came when the dwindling sacks of flour and coffee could no longer be ignored. "I'm going to town," Silas announced one morning, his back to her as he packed a few items into a saddlebag. "It's a full day's ride." A cold knot of anxiety formed in Ilara's stomach. The thought of being left alone, even for a day, was terrifying. The cabin was her sanctuary, but only because he was in it, a silent guardian against the vast emptiness outside. What if he did not return? What if, like her father, he decided she was too much of a burden and simply rode away? She must have made some small sound, because he paused and turned to look at her. He studied her face, his expression unreadable as always, but his gaze was intent. He seemed to weigh a decision in his mind. "You can stay," he said, his tone even. "Or you can come." The choice hung in the air between them. To stay was to surrender to her fear of abandonment. To go was to face a world she was not sure she was ready for, to expose her brokenness to the cruel judgment of strangers. She looked down at her legs, at the crutches that were now extensions of her own arms. She was not the same woman he had found dying on the plains. She lifted her chin. "I'll come," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The journey was arduous. Riding was impossible for her, so Silas had hitched a small, sturdy buckboard to a placid old mare. He laid blankets in the back for her, and she sat propped against their supplies, the jolting of the wheels sending dull, aching protests up her legs. As they traveled, the landscape that had once seemed a terrifying void now looked different. She saw the subtle variations in the grasses, the way the light caught on a distant mesa. Next to Silas, the world felt less threatening. The town was a shock to her system. After months of near-total isolation, the noise and bustle were overwhelming. People bustled along a dusty main street lined with clapboard storefronts. The sounds of voices, wagon wheels, and a distant blacksmith's hammer filled the air. And then came the stairs. As Silas helped her down from the buckboard, her crutches sinking into the thick dust, a hush fell over the people nearby. Eyes followed them, filled with a brazen, unwelcome curiosity. Whispers followed in their wake like vultures. She saw the looks they gave Silas, a mixture of fear and disdain. They saw him as a savage, a recluse from the hills, something not quite civilized. And then their eyes would travel to her crutches, to her plain, worn dress, and their expressions would curdle into a new kind of judgment. Pity mingled with suspicion. She could hear the questions in their silence. Who was she? What was this wild man doing with a crippled woman? She kept her eyes fixed on the ground in front of her, her knuckles white where she gripped her crutches. Every stare felt like a physical blow. But then she glanced at Silas. He seemed completely unaffected, his face a mask of indifference. He moved through the crowd with a purpose that parted them, his presence alone a deterrent to any open mockery. He tethered the horse and turned to her. "Stay here," he said, his voice low. He went into the mercantile, leaving her by the buckboard. Alone, she was a target. An older woman in a severe black bonnet eyed her up and down. "The Lord's judgment takes many forms," the woman said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Best be careful what company you keep, girl." The words were a slap, echoing the righteous cruelty of her father. Ilara's cheeks burned with shame. But as she looked at the woman's smug, pitiless face, something inside her shifted. The shame curdled into a slow-burning anger. These people knew nothing of her, nothing of Silas. They knew nothing of the quiet decency of the man who had set her bones and carved her crutches, who had brought her back from the brink of death. When Silas emerged from the store, his arms laden with sacks, he saw the tightness in her jaw, the defiant glint in her eyes. He looked at the murmuring townspeople, his gaze sweeping over them with cold contempt. He loaded the supplies, helped her back into the buckboard, and they left the town behind without another word. As the oppressive noise faded, replaced by the familiar whisper of the prairie wind, Ilara knew that her world had shrunk, but it had also solidified. It was the cabin. It was the land. It was the silent, formidable man beside her. The town with its cruel whispers was the outside, and she was firmly on the inside with him. Months passed. The heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. Ilara's legs grew stronger. The crutches were replaced by a single, sturdy cane that Silas had carved for her. She still walked with a pronounced limp, a permanent reminder of her ordeal, but she walked. The limp was a part of her now, a scar she was learning to accept. She could manage most of the household chores on her own and even tend the small vegetable garden she had insisted on planting near the cabin. The garden was her own piece of creation, a patch of order and life wrested from the wildness. One afternoon, as she was pulling the last of the carrots from the cool earth, a shape appeared on the horizon. It was not Silas. He was mending a fence line on the far side of the property. This was a lone rider, approaching steadily. A knot of primal fear, an instinct she thought she had conquered, tightened in her gut. She stood slowly, using her cane for support, and watched the rider grow closer. The horse was familiar. The slump of the man's shoulders was familiar. Her breath caught in her throat. It was her father. He rode not with the purpose of a traveler, but with the arrogant saunter of a man inspecting property he believed was his. He stopped a few yards from the cabin, his eyes sweeping over the neat garden, the stack of firewood, the solid little house. He looked at her, and his lip curled in a sneer. There was no remorse in his eyes, no flicker of paternal feeling. There was only a cold, covetous appraisal. "So," he said, his voice carrying the same false piety she remembered so well. "The prodigal daughter. It seems the Lord saw fit to provide for you after all." He dismounted, his movement stiff. He looked older, more frayed than she remembered, but the venom in him was undiminished. "Heard stories in town," he continued, gesturing vaguely toward the distant settlement. "About the hermit in the hills and his lame companion. Figured I'd come see what sort of charity you'd stumbled into." His gaze was predatory as he surveyed the small homestead. He was not here for her. He was here for what he imagined Silas possessed. Rumors of outcasts often included whispers of hidden gold or a secret fortune. Her father, a man who saw God's will in his own greed, had come to collect. "He's not here," Ilara said, her voice quiet but firm. She gripped the handle of her cane until her knuckles were white. The girl he had left for dead was gone. A man who takes in a stray must have a soft heart, her father mused, ignoring her. Or something to protect. Where is he? What has he got hidden out here? He took a step toward the cabin door. "That's none of your concern," Ilara said, moving to block his path. She stood between him and the home she had helped to build. "This is not your place," he laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Everything a daughter has belongs to her father. That is the law of God. You are my blood. What's yours is mine." He reached for her, his hand clamping down on her arm. "Now, stand aside, girl." The touch was a violation, a spark that ignited the kindling of her rage. "No," she said, her voice ringing with a strength that surprised them both. She wrenched her arm free. "You left me. You have no claim on me. You have no claim on anything here." His face darkened with fury. The veneer of piety vanished, revealing the brute beneath. "You defiant whelp. I broke you once. I can do it again." He raised his hand to strike her, the same hand that had condemned her to the wilderness. But before the blow could land, a new voice cut through the air, low and deadly. "Take your hand off her." Silas stood not 20 feet away, a rifle held loosely in his arms. He had approached with the silence of a hunting cat. His face was granite, and his eyes were chips of ice. He was not aiming the rifle. He did not need to. His presence alone was a weapon. Her father froze, his hand hovering in the air. He turned slowly, his bravado evaporating in the face of the silent, formidable man before him. Silas did not move, did not raise the rifle. He simply stood, an immovable object, his gaze locked on her father with an intensity that promised swift and terrible violence. The air crackled with a tension that was more potent than any shouted threat. This was not a confrontation of fists or bullets, but of wills, a primal standoff on a patch of contested ground. "This is a private matter," her father stammered, his eyes flicking nervously from Silas to the rifle and back again. "Between me and my daughter," she said. "You have no claim here," Silas stated, his voice flat and cold. "I believe her." He took a slow, deliberate step forward. "This is my land. She is under my protection." "You will leave." Her father, accustomed to wielding fear, found himself on the receiving end of a far purer, more elemental form of it. He was a man of bluster and false authority, and before Silas's quiet, absolute certainty, he deflated. He saw in Silas not a man to be reasoned with or intimidated, but a force of nature that would simply remove him if he did not comply. Ilara watched, her heart pounding, but her fear was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective pride. She was not a damsel in need of rescue. She was a partner in this defense. She had stood her ground first. Silas was her reinforcement, the unbreachable wall at her back. She took a half step to the side, positioning herself next to Silas, presenting a united front. She leaned on her cane, her limp a mark of survival, not weakness. She met her father's gaze, and for the first time in her life, she did not flinch. She saw him for what he was, a small, cruel man, shriveled by his own hatred. The power he had held over her for so long was gone, turned to ash in the fire of her own resilience. "Get off his land," she said, her voice echoing the finality of Silas's. It was her verdict, her final severing of a bond that had only ever brought her pain. Defeated, her father sputtered, searching for a parting shot, a final piece of scripture to twist into a weapon. But no words came. There was nothing left to say. He was an intruder here. His authority was meaningless. With a look of pure, impotent rage, he turned, scrambled onto his horse like a man fleeing a fire, and spurred the animal into a gallop. He did not look back. They stood together, Ilara and Silas, watching until he was nothing more than a speck of dust against the vast prairie sky. The silence that descended was profound, a cleansing peace. The threat had been met and vanquished, not by violence, but by the simple, unshakable truth of their shared existence. Silas finally lowered the rifle. He looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her face, seeing the new strength that had settled there, the calm that followed the storm. He saw the woman who had faced down her own demon and won. The wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves in her garden. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows from the cabin. The world felt quiet, settled, and theirs. The dust from her father's departure settled back onto the earth, and a profound quiet descended, deeper than any silence that had come before. It was the quiet of resolution, the calm after a long and brutal fever had finally broken. They stood there for a long time, side by side, watching the horizon where he had vanished. The prairie, once a symbol of her abandonment, now felt like a protective barrier, a vast and open space that belonged to them. Silas leaned the rifle against the cabin wall and turned to her. The fading sunlight softened the hard lines of his face, and in his eyes, she saw an emotion she had never seen there before, a deep, unguarded tenderness. The battle had not just been for the land or for her safety, it had been a declaration. When she had stood against her father, she had claimed her life. When he had stood with her, he had claimed her as part of his. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently take the cane from her hand. He examined the polished wood, the grip worn smooth by her palm. It was a simple object, but it held the entire story of her recovery. "You stood," he said, his voice low and rough with unspoken feeling. It was the highest praise he could offer. "You helped me stand," she replied, her voice thick. The gratitude she felt was too large for words, a swelling in her chest that made it hard to breathe. All this time, she had thought he was merely offering her tools for survival. Now she understood. He had been offering her a home. He looked from the cane to her face, then around at the small, sturdy cabin, the neat garden, the endless sky. "My father built this place with his own hands," he said, speaking more than she had ever heard him say at one time. "He said a home isn't the walls or the roof. It's the place your heart can be quiet." He paused, his slate-gray eyes holding hers. "My heart is quiet here, Ilara." With you, the confession, so simple and direct, struck her with more force than her father's blow ever could have. It was a truth laid bare, stripped of all artifice. He was not a man for poetry or grand pronouncements. He was a man of substance, of solid, foundational truths. He held out his hand, his palm calloused and rough. "This is your home," he said, his voice a vow. "If you'll have it. If you'll have me." It was not a question born of doubt, but an offering. A proposal that was not about possession, but about partnership. It was about building a life on the foundation they had already laid, one of mutual respect, quiet understanding, and shared resilience. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of pain or sorrow. They were tears of homecoming. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, a warm, solid anchor in the vastness of the world. "There is no other place," she whispered. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the first star pricked the darkening veil of the sky. In the twilight, two figures stood before a small cabin, their shadows merging into one. She was no longer the broken girl left to the wolves, and he was no longer the solitary man against the world. They were the beginning of a new story, written not in words, but in the enduring language of shared survival, quiet strength, and a love as rugged and real as the land itself. He had built her a home, and in doing so, had made her his bride, bound not by ceremony or law, but by the unbreakable ties of a life reclaimed and a future shared.